All right, so today we're going to start off by talking about Chapter 1, the Introduction to Human Communication. Let's start off by talking about just a definition. All right, so when you folks get the textbook, you'll turn to the first page of or the second page of the textbook, and of course we're going to start off with some kind of definition about what human communication is. So according to DeVito, human communication consists of the sending and receiving of verbal and nonverbal messages. So trying to have a situation where I'm standing up and talking to you folks in a nonverbal and verbal kind of framework gives us a little bit more meat to chaw on when we're talking about the actual messages in and of themselves. So inside of a communication situation, there's not only what you're communicating verbally and what people are encoding and decoding during the process, but also two or more people are looking at nonverbal messages that are out there. Later on in the lecture, we'll get to this notion of what we call not communicating, that even when you're non-verbally not giving a particular message to somebody, you're still communicating in some kind of powerful kind of way. So remember that human communication is the sending and receiving. So as I'm sending a message, you folks are decoding that message back into your own frame of reference, and it's between two or more individuals. So individuals are having an interactive process by which we're looking at both verbal and nonverbal communication means. Now, inside the world of human communication, there's tons of different ways in which we can look at different types of communication practices. Now, there is some debate as to whether or not we have a conversation with ourselves, right? So this whole notion of what we call intrapersonal communication. But there's, some psychological research that kind of bleeds over inside of the field of communication, talking about how, issues of confidence, self-esteem, self-disclosures usually happen at an intrapersonal level, so we sometimes have those internal dialogues. Then there's, of course, interpersonal communication, which is what I did most of my research on back at Santa Barbara, where we would take couples, we'd sit them down on a couch, we'd have them interact with each other, we'd have them ask questions, and we'd be looking at their nonverbal behaviors, or we'd be looking at the number of times they smiled towards each other, or the number of times they interrupted with each other. A very powerful form of human communication. We've got a full class on it, full people that can just major in it. The back of the textbook has a chapter on interviewing. I don't think we'll be able to get to it over the summer, but there are a lot of research out there with regards to interviewing, how you can become a more effective communicator in an interviewing situation. There's also a class here in small group where we put people into larger groups than just a dyadic, one-on-one interpersonal interaction. When we get to 3 or 4 people, things start changing. People start having leaders, and people have dissidents, and then people start to form teams inside of larger groups. So there's a lot of different dynamics there as well. Primarily for this class, we're going to be talking about what we call public communication. So you folks will be giving speeches over Zoom, and then we're going to be listening to those speeches in a public kind of framework. If you were back here in the classroom, you'd be in front of a PowerPoint presentation trying to disperse that message out to other individuals. We do have a class in computer-mediated communication as well, but unfortunately, we're just stuck in it right now. So there are some aspects of computer-mediated communication that we'll go over just by virtue of us being stuck in a Zoom classroom. And finally, of course, there's mass communication. So movies, newspapers, magazines, whoever the newest influencer is out there in some kind of way, all have aspects of mass communication where one message is being disseminated out to a larger audience. Now, today I'd like to talk to you folks about the first major theory of human communication. So you folks will probably you can download the PowerPoint too, it's on Canvas right now as well. I don't know if you can you see this over here? Or this little picture, or is that kind of out of the shot? I think maybe. Well, this is our first major theorist that we're going to go over as far as communication models go. This is Claude Shannon, one of those sexiest mans ever alive. Oh man, look at that guy. So he writes a book back in 1948 called The Mathematical Theory of Human Communication. So he's a person trying to figure out a way in which we can figure out how communication works. He's specifically dealing with telephone lines, actually. So he's trying to lay down a line that goes from New York all the way over to London and then comes back. And then he's trying to figure out, well, how do I set up the telephone station so that I get a good source message? And then how do I lay down the lines that go across the entire Atlantic to get over to London in some kind of way? And then through that long channel of wire, how do I sort of create situations where I can increase the signal to the message that's out there, or I can decrease the amount of noise that happens within the channel? And then finally, how do I take that telephone line at the very end and then turn it back into a listening or a cohesive sound? So he's trying to deal with these long sort of terminals, and he comes up with something that still applies towards all communication situations, or something we refer to as the signal-to-noise ratio. Because the longer that you have any communication line, the more you're going to have signal degradation, so the signal will get weaker, and then of course the higher the opportunities for noise to enter into the channel, which creates static. When you folks were kids, did you ever put like two cans on a long thread and try to do that old telephone game? Yeah, right? It's the same kind of thing, right? So you got the string and you've got your can that you're talking into, but the longer that wire gets, the more opportunities for the signal to get weaker, so it's going to be harder for the person to hear you, and the more noise that you're going to have within that particular channel. Now, this all refers to a larger concept that we'll refer to as the linear model of human communication. And at every stage, right, so the source is going to encode that message from your brain, and then of course the receiver is going to decode that message when they get it on the opposite end. Now, every one of these steps has a certain element to it, right, or it has something that's static to it in some kind of way. So first of all, every source that's sending a message out there has static aspects of that actual source. So no matter whether or not I'm giving a lecture inside of a classroom here, or if I'm talking from my computer at home, or maybe if I'm just chatting with you down at the local restaurant when we open back up, there are going to be certain aspects about me as an individual that are always going to stay static. They're always going to stay the same in some kind of way. The first of these is what we refer to as just credibility, or the infamous ethos. How many of us have heard of ethos before? We got one, we got two. What else does ethos come with? Yes, right? So ethos, pathos, and logos. You're going to hear a lot of that over the course of the semester, right? So credibility or ethos, the ethics of a speaker. This all comes from Aristotle way back in the day, right? So 300 BC, he writes essentially the first textbook on human communication. And so one of the first things he talks about is this notion of ethos. How many folks have that friend that you can always kind of believe? They always tell you the truth. They always know what they're talking about. Maybe you got one of those? Okay, how about the other way, right? How many folks got a friend who's just a complete idiot? Right? Whenever they say something, they never know what they're talking about. Right? You're just like, I'm not believing them. So there we go. Right? So some people have naturally higher ethos or lower ethos, or a lower level of credibility. And it's more than just knowing stuff, right? So credibility also involves a goodwill towards the audience. It also involves a certain level of charisma. So right now, you folks are probably trying to figure me out. You're like, this guy doesn't really know what he's talking about, right? Like, does he know what's up? But at the same point in time, you're also probably trying to figure out, is this the kind of guy who's going to give me an easy A, right? Am I going to be able to skate through this class, right? Does he seem to care about his students, right? So Aristotle would say that all this collectively refers to as a level of ethos or credibility towards a particular speaker. After credibility or ethos, we have knowledge. So what is just the general knowledge that individuals have about a particular area? And of course, you folks are going to do the hardcore research, and you're going to try and find the information that's going to increase your level of knowledge about any particular issue that's out there. We also have certain mannerisms. So some of us, I don't know, some of us maybe talk with our hands more, some people may be a little bit more expressive in the face, but we all have a nonverbal style, and this usually stays pretty static no matter what you're talking about. We all have kind of a level of energy. We have kind of a certain set of repetitive hand gestures that we might use in certain situations, but we all tend to have a pretty static nonverbal communication depending on whatever message we're talking about, something that's unique to the source. How about this one? You folks got like that friend that if you like pick up the phone or you're talking to him on the phone, let's grab my phone here for a second, right? So you pick up your phone and you're chatting with them, and you could be talking with them all stinking day, right? And you can just like grab that phone and you can take it, put it down, go over, make yourself a sandwich, right? And they're still bum, 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 bum. You pick up the phone and be like, and then put it back down. And then they just keep talking. Yeah, it doesn't matter. They'll talk just to hear themselves talk. Like they'll talk for like 30 minutes straight. And we got one of those? How about the other way? You folks have any of those friends you're talking on the phone, and if you even lapse for 1 second, you're like, oh my gosh, are you still listening to me? Like they all mad at you. Well, we all have different levels of sensitivity towards the audience. So some of us are really, really perceptive of whether or not another person's listening to us, and some of the other people that are out there aren't necessarily that attentive to what another person is saying. So we all, when in front of an audience, we want to make sure that we have some level of sensitivity, trying to play off of what they're doing. This is why we do this inside of a class, why everybody needs to have their cameras on, so we can try and figure out where the audience is standing on any particular issue. Finally, of course, there's dynamism, or how much energy you have while giving a speech in front of a larger group of audience members that are out there. And most of the research shows you don't want to be monotone and boring when talking about something, but rather you want to pep it up, you want to give a little bit more energy, or you want to get a little bit of dynamism towards the individuals that are out there. So that's the source, right? So no matter what I'm talking about, whether or not it's like we're grabbing Taco Bell after class, or if I'm giving a lecture in front of a larger audience, you're still going to have ethos, you're still going to have dynamism, you're still going to have a sensitivity towards the audience. They're all going to be the same. Now the actual message itself, or what kind of message I'm trying to get across to you, might be a little bit different. So the definition, of course, of the message is it's transmitted or received through one or more sensory organs, or a combination of both. So it's a nonverbal and a verbal way of which we're talking with each other. And there's primarily three different types of messages. So first of all, there's what we call feed forwarding. This is one of the things I think we really miss about being on campus is, you know, it used to be you'd stand outside over here by the door, everybody would be talking in the hallway, you'd be making new friends, you'd go on break, you'd be hanging out with other people, and you'd be engaging in small talk, right? Or what the textbook refers to as phatic communication. Ooh, that's a big word. I bet you I put that one on a midterm. Yeah, right? Oh man, that sucks. Yeah. Well, the thing is so I'm recording from a third camera back here, so I'm gonna have a full thing that's gonna go up there. But let's see if I can try and do this. And that's as far as we can do. Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to figure this stuff out. I'm probably going to have to re-record it again. Oh, I love being in an online situation, right? You folks are loving this too, aren't you? Oh, man. So you engage in feed forward or priming a particular message that's out there. And then, of course, this is small talk. You know, things like your name, your occupation, stuff you'd normally have when you're talking with people at a dinner party. When we finally get back to a situation where we're actually talking at dinner parties. And then, of course, there's feedback, right? So you folks are giving me feedback at the same point in time. You're like, hey, wait a second, that PowerPoint isn't coming up right, the camera's messed up, I've got 4 of them going and none of them seem to be working right. And, of course, the audio feed's messed up on 3 cameras, too. So as a person speaking, you are getting a feedback loop from those other individuals while they're trying to talk to you. And then finally, of course, sometimes we do have conversations about conversations, right? So we have what we call meta messages. These are messages that refer to other messages. So this lecture right here is in fact a meta message. So this is a situation where we're having a conversation about communication. If you've ever had a moment in time where you've needed to talk about your relationship or something along those lines, you might be in a situation where you're giving a meta message towards another individual. Where do we exactly stand in this relationship? But sometimes we have communication about communication, and henceforth the term meta message. Now, when the message comes through, and actually goes through the actual channel that's out there, we find ourselves in a situation where we might be subject to noise. So, just as how the longer the channel is, the more there's a chance for degradation, there's also a situation where we also see the increase of noise within a particular channel as well. So anything that interferes with the transmission of a message. So normally in a classroom, this would be a lot easier, right? I'd be talking to you folks as students. Those students would be, 10, 15 feet away from me. It'd be pretty easy to get that information across to you in some kind of way. But now, of course, we're in a whole different kind of channel, right? So now I've got to make sure that the internet connection is strong enough. I've got to make sure that the recording equipment is set up right. And this recording is probably going to come out absolutely horribly after I'm done with it. All because we have so many different factors that contribute to the noise of the actual channel. Now, when you folks are going back and reading the textbook, there are going to be primarily 4 different types of noise that you'll be tested on. So the first, of course, is just physical noise. So if you've got, somebody running around inside your room right now, you've got somebody yelling and screaming in the background, you've got cars that are coming by, these would all be examples of physical noise that's invading your channel. Also, just static across the line, a bad internet connection, these would all be physical forms of what's actually happening with regards to noise inside the channel. Sometimes we might have physiological noise, so this might be actually something physically wrong with your ear or physically wrong with the way in which I'm encoding the message. So if you have like a hearing impairment, or you have some kind of, you need a hearing aid or some kind of like that, or maybe even if the volume on your computer doesn't get loud enough for you to be able to hear it, then you have a physiological noise complication to what's going on. There's also psychological noise, and this is the most common, right? So most of you folks, how many folks had a class before this one? Right? So for you folks, you might be a little tired, right? So now you're working on like hour 4. You're like, oh gosh, man, I just need a break. I need to eat breakfast, right? I need more coffee. So you might have psychological noise problems that are going on. Or maybe you're just coming off of last semester. You're like, dude, I just got done with that last class. Why am I starting back up with summer so quickly, right? Or maybe you just had a big fight with one of your significant others. All these things can contribute to what's going on inside of your mind, where you might have a psychological noise problem that's going on. And then finally, of course, there's what we call semantic noise. And this is where we just have word confusion. So my favorite, of course, is the word right. Right? I think last time I looked it up, the word right has something like 30 or 40 different interpretations. It could be right as in like you're correct. It could be right as an ideological preference. It could be a political preference. It could be physically going right. It could be the W-R-I-T-E type of right. So there are so many different interpretations of the word right. And I'm sure we've been in that, right? Where you're in a car and you're like, hang it right up here, and like, no, left, right? You have some kind of semantic noise that might actually occur with the actual words that are being described inside of the channel. Now, taking a second to talk about what actually happens inside of channels. Now, I'm telling you, I know how I'm gonna die. Right? Like nuclear war doesn't scare me. Like climate change, nah, that's not going to happen by the time I die. Right? Like getting into a car accident, nah, probably not. I'm going to eventually die because of a text message. I'm telling you, right? How many folks have gotten in a fight over a text message in the last week? Maybe, right? How many folks have gotten in a fight over a text message in the last month? Yeah, you've been there, right? I'm telling you, texting is the word. This is what's going to kill me. Somebody's going to misinterpret a text message. They're going to come over. They're going to beat the crap out of me. I'm going to die, right? It's because, right, inside of channels, we have what we call rich versus lean communication channels. So I'm personally an interpersonal communication instructor. I try to do as much as I can to enhance the channels as best I possibly can. And that's why I love being in a classroom. After class, you hang out, I'm talking to you face to face, we get to interact, you get to see my facial expressions, you get to get my jokes, these kinds of things. It's a very rich communication channel. There's very, very little opportunity for something to go wrong. However, when we move up to a public speaking kind of situation, there's a little bit more opportunity because, it tends to be more one way, and it tends to be a little bit less, face-to-face, rich communication and interaction. There's oftentimes more opportunities for noise because people might be sitting in the back of a room. Maybe even worse, we might be in a situation like this where we got teleconferencing, where you folks are trying to figure out which window to look at while I'm trying to figure out which camera to look at to try and give you the best recording. And then, of course, I'm sure the gallery versus the speaker view is driving you folks nuts. But that's still not that bad compared to getting just on the phone, right? Because when you're on a phone, you start to lose some of these aspects of the channel. You lose the rich face-to-face kind of interactions. Sarcasm gets harder to get. It's hard to see somebody smiling or somebody frowning while talking to you. But this is the worst, right? And I don't know why we as human beings have gone with texting, right? I'm one of those people that if somebody texts me and I text back and it goes more than 3 or 4, I'm just going to call you, right? I'm just going to be like, hey, what's up? Let's chat, right? But I swear I have friends where they'll be texting me for 3 hours and I pick up the phone to call them and they still won't pick up, right? It's like, oh, no. I'm going to sit here and text you all day, right? How many folks have been on a Friday night, you're sitting in a group chat with all your friends, you're trying to figure out what to do, and you end up spending 3 hours in the group chat and you never do anything? right? Yeah, you've all been there, right? Texting is the worst, right? It's just a communication lean channel. You don't get jokes, you don't get sarcasm, you don't get facial expressions, you don't get body language, and then we try to fix it with emojis, right? Like, oh my gosh, if I throw in a little winky face, it somehow makes the conversation more real. Like, it's the biggest joke in the entire world. Texting is so ridiculous, right? Like, oh, throw an eggplant on it. Like, why don't you just pick up the phone and talk to somebody? Have a more communication-rich channel. But of course, we don't get that. And then even worse than texting is what we're going to be dealing with for the next month, right? Which is all this email. Because you don't know when somebody's going to email you back. It's asynchronous. And of course, you don't even get the emojis to throw in too, right? And then of course, at the lowest end, or the most communicatively lean channel that you would have is just regular mail, when you're trying to send out a message via the old post. But I guess it's so rare, it might actually be something special nowadays. So now the message has started with a speaker, it's got some sort of content to the actual message itself, and it goes down the channel and eventually gets to the listener. So now you folks on your end of the Zoom computer's world, try to decode the message and complete the entire loop, right? So then you give us a feedback loop in some kind of way, whether it's be something in the chat, or whether or not you're yelling and screaming back at the camera, back at the recording right now. But when you folks decode a particular message, you're decoding it through your own frame of reference, right? So remember this term, this will be on the midterm exam as well. So all of us have a frame of reference. We all have a set of attitudes, beliefs, and experiences that decode the way a particular message is going to come across to you. So for every individual that's inside of this classroom right now, you have a certain attitude towards school that's keeping your camera on or keeping you taking notes. Or maybe on the opposite end, you've got a bad attitude towards school and you're just zoning out, you shut off your camera, and you don't give a damn, right? These might also be reflected in some of your belief patterns. You might believe that, hey, if I take this class and I get a good grade, it's eventually going to get me that white picket fence house, the 2.5 cars, the 3.2 kids, the 6.7 TVs, all the different things that are going to make about success when you get that job that pays you the extra money because you got that degree here at Cypress College. And then finally, of course, you might have experiences. You know, some of you folks might be starting your college career and you're like, dude, this guy is a whack job, right? Or some of you folks might be in college for a long time and you're just like, man, I'm so over it. Like, I'm going to drop this class and take it in fall, right? But we all have a different frame of reference that's going to affect the way in which we decode any particular message that comes across to you. Your attitudes, your beliefs, and your experiences are going to affect the way in which you're going to pay attention inside of this class, depending on how much of a positive or a negative experience you've had with the educational process. So this is the graph that they put inside the textbook, so you probably want to be kind of familiar with what this graph is all about. So remember, at any given point in time, you folks are working as both sources and receivers. So I am working as a source that's sending a message to you folks, but at the same point in time, you're giving me a feedback loop with regards to your nonverbal communication that I'm paying close attention to. Sometimes we can feed forward the message, like, hey, are you folks getting it? Are you trying to figure it out? Does this recording work okay for me? And then at the same point in time, we are all affected by the messages and the channels and all the noise that's going on. So jumping between computer screens right now, other noise that might be going on inside of your house, or if somebody starts running up and down the halls here at Cypress, it's all going to affect the way in which this message comes across to you folks. So this is probably a pretty good model to take a look at. And then also you want to remember that all communication happens within a particular context. So we all have contextual cues. You know, just by mere fact of us being inside of a computer-mediated communication situation here is going to decrease your ability to capture all the information. It's just naturally going to hurt you more than if you were in a situation where you folks were face-to-face. So what is that context? Well, a communication context determines to a large extent the meaning of any verbal or nonverbal communication situations that are out there. So all kinds of human communication, depending on the context of the scenario, is going to affect the way in which people are going to interpret that particular message. You know, if you were chatting with me on the street and I wasn't wearing a suit, we'd have a far different conversation than as if I'm giving a lecture to you folks inside of a classroom. I mean, even coming down to campus to record this in a particular way so I can put it up online is trying to add an extra contextual variable for when you folks watch this stuff later on tonight or right before the midterm. There's the physical context, right? So right now I'm inside of a classroom. But in addition to the physical context, there's also a cultural context, So right now we're in a situation where, I mean, you folks might even be defined for the rest of your lives as being the pandemic generation, right? Being individuals who are trapped inside a lockdown, having to take classes because we went through this horrible virus. There may be other cultural contexts that might affect this as well, you know, so you might be in a family that's telling you you have to sit through these damn Zoom lectures or else they're gonna kick you out of the house. Anybody in that situation? Mom and dad are gonna kick me out unless I finish my classes? Man. Or you might be in a situation where you're doing it on your own particular, your own mores or your own, by your own independence because your family hasn't given you that cultural context to back it up. We also have a socio-psychological context, right? So where you're coming from as an individual at any given point in time, your attitudes towards education, the time of day that you might be doing, well, that's more of a temporal, but you have a socio-psychological context which deals with your own personal psychological variables and your attitudes towards education that is going to add an extra contextual variable to how you interpret this. And then finally, of course, there's time. You know, if you're taking this class at 8 o'clock in the morning or if you're taking it at 6 o'clock at night, it's going to affect the way in which you're trying to look at a particular message. One of the main reasons why I'm coming back into the classroom in fall is night classes, man. I'm telling you, you cannot do Zoom past 9 p.m. at night, or even 8:30, right? Students just start falling asleep. Anybody take a night class last semester? Or anybody try and get through one? No night classers? Well, more power to you. Eventually the effect is that all communication eventually has a consequence. So that in all communication situations, there's always a consequential aspect to what that communication is. So even if you're not communicating towards another individual and you're staying silent, it still has a consequence towards those other individuals. All right, I'd like to finish off, well, let's see, just a couple more slides here. Okay, so there are some general principles of human communication. Back in 1967, there was a group of researchers over at Stanford University, Václavic, Bevan, and Jackson. And they were trying to figure out whether or not there is what they call an axiomatic form of human communication. Are there certain rules to human communication that are universal? How many folks have taken an algebra class before? We've all taken algebra, right? So in an algebra class, you know, you might learn like 3 times 2 is equal to 2 times 3. It's referred to as the reflexive axiom of mathematics. So these researchers are trying to figure out, are there universal rules or what we call axiomatic principles about human communication? And so no matter what we're communicating about, so whether or not I'm giving a lecture, or if I'm like, hey, let's go grab some Taco Bell after class, or or if I'm trying to help you with your homework, or if I'm just hanging out and shooting pool with you somewhere, there's always going to be certain universal aspects of the human communication process. First of all, is that it always has a purpose. When we communicate with somebody, there is some kind of purpose. It accomplishes some kind of goal in some kind of human way. Now this, of course, is culturally variable, so certain different cultures emphasize different cultural aspects of the particular message. But in general, we usually communicate to learn, i.e. in this class. Right now, you folks are hopefully learning something that's out there. We can also use communication to relate to other people, so we start to form an interpersonal bond. I self-disclose something about me to you folks as a classroom or to you folks as individuals, and then you disclose something back to me, and then yay, we start to form a bond. We can also use communication to help other individuals. So when we call out for help in a particular situation or we need somebody to assist us, communication is the primary vehicle by which we use that. We use communication to influence. So the last speech in this class, you'll be trying to persuade the class or influence us in a way that tries to move us closer towards your particular viewpoint or stance on any issue. And then finally, of course, sometimes we use communication just to play, where we're just playing around or just engaging in some sort of fun or festivities. Hopefully you folks will get a chance to do some of that during July 4th. Now, so communication has a purpose. It's purposeful in some kind of way. It accomplishes a goal that's out there. But also, communication can be ambiguous, too, right? So I don't know if you folks have ever had that person who plays around with language, right? Like, so are we an exclusive relationship? Well, we're friends, right? Well, how big are we as friends, right? You know, a lot of times we can use communication to beat around the bush, or it has a natural ambiguity to it. And sometimes people will take advantage of this by ill-defining communication goals or ill-defining communication relationships. So the first thing you need to understand is just what ambiguity is, right? The condition in which something can be interpreted in more than one way, right? So a lot of times communication can be equivocal. It can have two different interpretations. So if I just said the word right, you don't know if it's R-I-G-H-T or if it's W-R-I-T-E because it's a homophone, right? It's got the same kind of language, it's said the same way even though it's spelled differently. So sometimes we have levels of language ambiguity. So sometimes we have words that we don't understand regardless of the context that are out there, just because the mere nature of language oftentimes allows for what we call equivocality, or two different interpretations of the same term. There's also what we call relationship ambiguity, and this is probably where you folks have experienced this even more so, right? Where you are in a situation where you might be defining a relationship in a different kind of way than somebody else is defining it out there. And when you don't define those actual relationships in the proper kind of way, you might find yourself in a situation where one person's getting jealous, or another person's getting defensive, or wants to run away from a relationship because there is some kind of ambiguity between the relationship of the two people that are speaking. So communication has some kind of ambiguity to it, and there's play inside of it, so you don't necessarily lock yourself down. And sometimes people will be more ambiguous or more abstract in their words because they want to have more ambiguity in their communication style, and sometimes will try and be more concrete. Now, for the purposes of speaking in front of an audience, and you're trying to teach us something, you want to try and be as less ambiguous. You want to be as concrete as possible, but we'll talk about that in chapter 3. Now, every time we do talk, though, there's also elements of this. So communication always involves the content of what we're talking about, the language structures that we're using, but then there's also always a relationship moment with regards to communication. So as the semester progresses, and as you folks get to know each other more, and as you get to know me more, you're going to find out that the relationship dimension will have a fast effect on what's going on with regards to communication. So right now, you may be spending more time trying to figure out, is this the kind of professor who gives me an A, as opposed to the material that we're actually looking at, because you have some kind of ambiguity about that particular relationship. So you're not really figuring out who exactly I am as a person yet, and you're probably questioning that, especially on something like the first day of class. And remember that all this communication always exists at both these levels. So there's always the content when we're talking about, and then the relationship we have with the other individual while having that conversation. Okay, all right. So this is the last of our axioms of human communication. So first of all, remember that communication always is punctuated, right? So just as I'm moving back and forth and changing slides, or you folks might be changing slides on the PowerPoint presentation that you have in front of you, there's a segmentation that always occurs with regards to human communication. There is a situation where it moves in and a situation where it moves out. Yeah, so hopefully if this all goes well, I'll be able to reload this back up to YouTube in some kind of way. There is already, actually, the Shannon and Weaver part of it is already up on YouTube, if you folks want to click into that. But hopefully this should work out. I don't know. Well, I'll take a look at it afterwards. So we'll segment this out, right? So you can segment out part of it by going to the YouTube page and taking a look at that, or you'll be able to segment this out depending on how good the recording comes across. But good old communication always has segmented inside of a larger continuous stream of communication. So we can call this a larger lecture, and this is just one part that gets segmented out inside of it. Now, this might be attributed to some things being causes, right? So this stupid coronavirus has put us in a situation where I've got a cause to have to try and record this stuff from all these different cameras. Or we might have other situations where there are effects. So some of you folks might be really tired. This is the end of your second class. It's time for you to just shut down the camera and take yourself a big nap. Just hold through with me for a little bit more. We just got 2 slides left. Which gets us to our 3 big points, right? So this is the stuff that's on the exam. Communication is irreversible. You can't take it back. It's inevitable, and it's unrepeatable. So remember that all communication is inevitable, that no matter what you're doing in any particular situation, you cannot not communicate. So even if you shut off your camera during class, that still says something to me as an instructor. You know, even if you fall asleep during class, it still says something to me. Or if I take a break or I'm communicating, you're always communicating something. So how many of us are really good at giving somebody the silent treatment? Right? Yeah, it is a communication behavior. Be it passive aggressive, or maybe not necessarily the best. You cannot not communicate. You're always communicating in some kind of way. The second thing is that it's irreversible. How many folks have been in a situation where you're like, oh shoot, I wish I could take that back? Maybe you disclosed too much information to somebody, maybe you cursed at somebody when you didn't want to. These kinds of situations, you can't uncommunicate that message, right? Unlike what Facebook lets you do now, right? But communication is irreversible, right? You can't unsend a particular message that you send out there to the audience. And then of course communication is unrepeatable. So even though I've been giving this lecture for almost 20 years now, it's never done the same way twice. And especially inside of the Zoom framework, right? A communication act can never be duplicated. So even though I still will get a YouTube video out of this and I'll put it up there, I'm still gonna edit it and change it. It's not gonna be the exact same thing as what I'm putting up right now in this raw format that we have. Okay, so final kind of last slides here. I want to take a second to talk about culture with regards to communication. Of course, it affects everything. We need to take a look at it and unpack it. So culture, of course, consists of the beliefs, the ways of behaving, and the artifacts of a particular group. By definition, culture is transmitted through a communication process. So there's a lot of really interesting research talking about genetics, right, where your race is passed down by, your chromosomes and how your body actually biologically recreates DNA inside of yourself, but your culture is passed down through communication. And instead of your genes, it's passed down through your memes, right? So the actual term memetic transfer has been around for a while. The term meme actually comes from a guy named Richard Dawkins, who talks about how we use oral communication traditions to pass down cultural variables and learn rather than through the genetic variables that we take a look at. And finally, oops. Just to finish off today's lecture, just want to take a second to talk about, there are a number of different cultural constructs that are out there. So there's this guy named Gerd Hofstede in 1984. He's working for IBM, and he's trying to figure out ways to sell computers across all the different countries that are out there in the world. And he finds that there are different dimensions or cultural dimensions that we can take a look at when looking at how other individuals communicate. And so he looks at all the different cultures of the world. He's been doing this research for 30, 40 years now. And he finds that, regardless of culture, he says that there's pretty much 7 different major dimensions that sort of change from culture to culture. So some cultures might have a high level of what we call uncertainty avoidance. Like, how many folks know what you're going to major in? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, okay, that's a little bit high for now. So how many folks have no idea? You're just taking classes at community college. You're going to figure it out along the way. Okay, and you're allowed to do that, right? Because we have a little bit more tolerance of uncertainty inside of American culture. For like the 5 people who still have their cameras on. Hey, thank you, folks, for you folks who keep keeping your cameras on. So in American culture, we have a high tolerance for uncertainty. It doesn't really necessarily, we don't have to know what we're majoring in right now. We're allowed to take community college classes. We can figure that stuff out. Whereas some other places, you might have a very, very tight sort of life where you had to take your SATs and score high to get to the university to make sure you get that good job, the 3.2 kids, the 2.3 cars, the 6.2 TVs, and the white picket fence. But we all have different levels of uncertainty, and this, of course, is a variable that changes over cultures. There's also levels of masculinity versus femininity. I'm sure you folks can think of hyper-masculine cultures that are out there in the world, and this privileging of the male, sort of aggression, conflict, competition, versus there are other cultures that are much more feminine, that are much more about nurturing, creating social support structures within their culture, making sure that you look out for everyone. There are issues of power distance that change from culture to culture. So, even down to how far you stand away from a professor is something that changes over culture. Some cultures give a lot of power distance, both psychologically and physically, to people that are in positions of power. Think about how judges are up on dioceses, right, sitting in high chairs, and the lawyers are on the lower area. And then, of course, the criminals are put into little corners, right? Issues of power distance play out within different cultures. There's also what we refer to as individualism versus collectivism. How much do we premiate the individual and their own success, which is very, very high in American society. You folks are in competition with each other to get that A, right? Versus collectivism, where we're trying to look at the larger society and how much it advances towards other individuals that are out there. There's high versus low context. So how much do I beat around the bush when communicating with you varies from culture to culture. We are in a kind of low context culture where everything's sort of say it as you say, as you mean it. You know, I like to keep it simple. I like to just be a straight shooter. Whereas in a high context culture, I might beat around the bush and give you numerous opportunities to sort of read into what I'm saying before I explicitly tell you what my problem is or my request or these kinds of things. Cultures change with regards to indulgence versus restraint. So some cultures a little bit more party-oriented than other cultures, which might advocate for a little bit more restraint in their actual in their excess, if you will, in their temperance. And then finally, of course, long versus short-term orientation. So right now, you folks, if we're just starting a class, you're thinking, oh gosh, can I just get through this class and get my A? But then there's also the long-term orientation of where this gets you as far as a degree, whether or not you're going to transfer out, get yourself to another university, whether or not you're going to go to a master's program. So some cultures really emphasize short-term orientation, getting through the here and now, making it day by day, whereas other cultures tend to be much more long-term oriented. And this tends to have a lot to do with what we refer to as the uncertainty avoidance that happens in a particular situation.